by David, God's anointed king over Israel. And during his kingship, David experienced some pretty harsh betrayals by those who were closest to him. First, his son Absalom betrayed him, as recorded in 2 Samuel 13 through 17. And then if that wasn't bad enough, his own wife's grandfather Ahithophel betrayed him also. And out of those betrayals, David likely pens this psalm. And in writing this psalm, David prophesies the betrayal that would one day fall on his promised descendant of the Messiah. And as I'm going through this psalm tonight, I want you to simply listen and to think at the words that we are about to look at. Does this sound at all like what happened to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane? Now, before we begin, you should understand that this psalm follows and I'm going to throw a word out there for you and you can look it up later, but it's a chiastic structure. In other words, the whole psalm builds up to a central section, if that makes sense. And then it flows away from that section in a parallel manner. So there you have kind of the outline. If you had to have an outline for the psalm, it would look like that, kind of a pyramid structure. In this case, verses 1 through 3 line up with verses 22 through 23. Verses 4 through 8 line up with verses 20 through 21. Verses 9 through 11 line up with verses 16 through 19, and then you have that center core of the psalm where you get at the heart of what's going on in verses 12 through 15. And so there are 7 units to this psalm, and the middle unit is verses 12 through 15, which serves as the heart of this psalm, a middle unit that is all about the king responding to those who have turned against the Lord and have turned against his anointed. And so I want us to see the first point in verses 1 through 8. We see the king's appeal. 1 through 3, the king's appeal. David begins by writing, "Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me." So this is the king's response we see here to his betrayal. And I think it's interesting that this is how he responds to betrayal. He has just been betrayed by another human being, and his response is not to go out there and to attack the one who betrayed him and to defend his reputation. Rather, his response is to first turn to God and pour out his heart to him. He responds to the betrayer through prayer. And the king's pretty shook up by this betrayal, by the way. He says at the end of verse 2, "Attend to me and answer me, for I am restless." In other words, I'm agitated and in my complaint, and I moan. In other words, sometimes I can't even find words to say, but my heart just aches. Why? Verse 3, "Because of the noise of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. For they drop trouble on me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me." So here's the situation that the king introduces at the beginning of the psalm. Out of a heart of grudging anger, you could summarize it this way: the wicked have suddenly dropped trouble upon me. And I'm in the midst of all of their noise and all of their chaos and all of their oppression. And this is, you could put it this way, threatening to steal my peace, which is a theme that we'll see in this psalm and a theme we saw this morning. And the king goes on to describe how this betrayal is affecting him in verses 4 through 8. This is the king's anguish. He says in verse 4, "My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me." Listen to that description. Does it sound familiar? The king's body is shaking and shuddering under the weight of the trial that he's going through. Because of his betrayal, the terrors of death have fallen on him. Fear and trembling have come upon him. Horror overwhelms him. And what is his initial response? He says in verse 6, "And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Yes, I would wander far away. I would lodge in the wilderness, Selah. I would hurry to find a shelter from the raging wind and tempest." In other words, the king wants to escape. He wants, to borrow the Garden of Gethsemane image, the cup to pass. He wants to find a way to avoid what is falling on him. But what's interesting is he doesn't. And that's what we'll see with the rest of the psalm. Instead of bowing out and taking a way of escape, the king prays to the Lord to do his will. Having expressed his desire to find any other way to get out of this, the king calls to the Lord for justice and then stands fast to see the Lord act on his behalf. That's what we see next in verses 9 through 11. This is the king's argument. In other words, this is what he's asking the Lord to do. Verses 9 through 11. Verse 9, destroy, O Lord, divide their tongues. And then he gives the reasons following. First, he says, destroy, O Lord. That word literally means swallow up. It's the same word used, if you remember, in Numbers 16, when the ground swallowed up Korah in his rebellion and betrayal against God and God's people. And so David is saying here, swallow these people up, O Lord. And then he says, divide their tongues. That expression goes right back to Genesis chapter 11, if you remember, with the Tower of Babel, where God did what? Divided the languages of the people. And so really what's happening in this verse is the king is evoking these two earlier acts of judgment that God engaged in on behalf of his people, and he's calling on God to do the same today, just like he did back then. Judge those who rebel against you and betray you, Lord. Destroy them, divide their tongues. Why? End of the verses 9 through 11. For I see violence and strife in the city. And here the author almost personifies violence and strife. He says, day and night they, that is violence and strife, go around on its walls, and iniquity and trouble are within. Ruin is in its midst. Oppression and fraud do not depart from the marketplace. In other words, the city is completely overrun by wickedness and sin. And so the king asks God to execute justice. Swallow up all violence and strife, he prays. Swallow up all iniquity and trouble. Swallow up all ruin and oppression and fraud in your judgment. Why? Is it because the king is hard-hearted and cruel? Is that why? No. It is because all of the things that he's asking for them to be destroyed and swallowed up are harmful for people, are they not? In fact, it would be the worst thing for those things not to be dealt with. It's bad for the city, it's bad for the people, it's harmful, and it's only when wickedness is swallowed up by justice that people can be safe and secure and whole and have peace in their lives. And so the king prays, destroy and swallow up all violence and strife and iniquity and trouble and ruin and embodiment and fraud, and begin by swallowing up the person who personifies all of these things. Verses 12 through 15, this is the king's assailant in verses 12 through 15. See, it is one thing, if we stop to consider it this evening, it is one thing to have someone who is openly an enemy, who is outwardly antagonistic. That's sometimes easier to deal with, isn't it? Because then you know where the attacks are going to come from, and you expect it. This is the way it's going to be. But it's entirely another thing when someone who had always been on your side defects, and a person who always had your back suddenly stabs you in it. That is a grievous wound, and that's why the king says in verse 12, for it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolent with me, then I could hide it, right? So in King David's place, if it was the Philistines, I could take care of that. I've handled that before. In Jesus' case, if it was the Pharisees, that's okay. I've dealt with it. But here he says, verse 13, but it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together. Within God's house, we walked in the throng. In other words, we did everything together. We shared our cares and concerns. We lived life together. We talked late into the night together, and then you turned on me, and you betrayed me, and everything that we stood for. So the king is saying here, you've turned your back on me, on the king, on the Lord's anointed, and therefore you've turned your back on God. So this is what he says in verse 15, let death steal over them. Let them go down to Sheol alive, for evil is in their dwelling place and in their hearts. In other words, God, in light of what they've done, give them what they deserve. That's what he's praying. This person that betrayed me, it's not like they betrayed me and they didn't know better. They betrayed me not in ignorance. They betrayed me and you and your anointed king from a fullness of knowledge, from an intimate awareness. They have, as he says here in verse 15, they have chosen evil to be their dwelling place and their companion, and they have rejected their anointed with their eyes wide open. Therefore, since they have rejected grace, give them justice. That's what the king is praying. It would have been better, if we think of what Jesus said, for that man to have never been born. This is the king's assailant. That brings us next to the king's assurance in verses 16 through 19. This is when it gets good. David says, "But I call to God, and the Lord will save me." Notice the king is absolutely confident in God. I will call upon God, and the Lord might. No, he says the Lord will save me. We need to imitate this in our own lives, this confidence in God's ability. There is no sin from which the Lord cannot cleanse us. There is no difficulty from which the Lord cannot save us. There is not one request that we can give this evening according to his will that he cannot answer. And in that confidence, look at how the king prays. He says in verse 17, evening and morning and at noon. In other words, because I believe that God can do this, I pray at all times. I utter my complaint and I moan, and he hears my voice. The king's confidence on the rise, even though he's in the midst of all of this chaos, in the middle of all this betrayal, he keeps praying and keeps out calling out in faith because he is sure that God hears him. Verse 18, he redeems my soul in safety. It's interesting, that word safety comes from the word peace. He redeems my soul, and he redeems it while my soul exists in a state of peace. From the battle that I wage, for many are arrayed against me. Isn't that beautiful? He redeems my soul in safety from the battle that I wage, for many are arrayed against me. Though my enemies are many, and though they swirl around me, I stand in confidence knowing that God will redeem my soul in peace. Verse 19, God will give ear and humble them, he who is enthroned from of old, Selah. So here is the wellspring from which the king's boldness arises in prayer. It arises from God's eternal sovereignty. He is, the king proclaims, enthroned of old. Now, when you think about that in terms of David, right? David was running out of Jerusalem because of Absalom. He had lost his throne. What was his confidence? The Lord has been enthroned forever. And you have Jesus, the true king, who came down out of heaven in glory. He is being betrayed, handed over to sinful men. What is his confidence? The Lord has been enthroned forever, from of old. God is in control. I don't need to be afraid, even in the midst of betrayal. God will humble them, he says. He will judge them just as I prayed. How does the king know? End of verse 19. He knows that the king will do this because they're unrepentant. There's only one thing that happens to unrepentant sinners, and that's justice. Because he says, because they do not change and do not fear God. The king is bold and confident in the midst of his enemies because he knows the character of God. God will make all things right. Those who turn to him will be saved. Those who do not will be judged. God will judge the unrepentant just as he has promised. So really, verses 16 through 19, again, according to this structure, lines up with verses 9 through 11. In verses 9 through 11, the king is praying that God would establish justice because the city is overrun in wickedness. And verses 16 through 19 is the answer to that prayer. The king who is enthroned of old hears and will humble those in unrepentant wickedness. Though darkness has fallen, the king remains at peace, because God is in control. Does that sound like what we saw this morning? Finally, we look at the king's amazement, and then we'll look at the king's admonishment. The king's amazement, verses 20 through 21. My companion stretches out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant. In other words, this betrayer did the most grossest form of betrayal, and yet he did it like it was absolutely nothing. Look what he says in verse 21. His speech was as smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. Greetings, Rabbi. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords, right? His friend, his sweet counselor, a companion, turned on him. He broke his promise. He violated his trust with hidden malice. It reminds me again of when Jesus said, would you betray the Son of Man with a, what? A kiss? And if you can't trust even the closest of friends, then you know what a situation like this makes you think of. Can can I trust anyone? And the answer is yes, you can trust the Lord. And that is the lesson that the king wants to teach us from his betrayal in verses 22 through 23. So what is the lesson to learn from the king's betrayer? It is this. This is his admonishment, verses 22 through 23. Cast your burden where? Not on friends. They could stab you in the back. You never know. Cast your burden where? On the Lord, and he will sustain you. That is wonderful. You know, sometimes you come to clear statements of Scripture and you just have to decide, will I believe this or not? Because it is very clear what it is saying. And that is one of these statements. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. If you ask for his strength and his grace and his mercy, he will give it. You can believe that. You should grab hold of that promise and never let it go. That is a refrigerator verse. Put it on your refrigerator. Cast your burden on the Lord. He will sustain you. Now it's interesting, that word burden in the Hebrew carries with it the idea of that which is given to you. And I love that, because the idea is all of us are given circumstances in life from God that are hard to deal with, whether it be a betrayal or something else. And yet, what are we supposed to do with the thing that God has given us? It is a test of faith to see whether we will give it back to him. And if we give it back to him, he will sustain us. When we cast our circumstances on him, he will bear us up and hold us fast. As he says at the end of this verse, he will never permit the righteous to be moved. Notice, it is the Lord that is keeping the righteous. It is the Lord that is making sure that the righteous do not stumble. It is the Lord that is making it so that they don't slide away. In fact, there's kind of a two-sided connection here. He says, cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. In fact, he will never let the righteous be moved. You ask yourself the question, well, who are the righteous? How can you tell them apart from the unrighteous? Simple. The righteous are those who are not moved because they are casting their burdens on the Lord. That's who they are. For the righteous, to pray is to breathe. It is something that you do. God throws a difficult circumstance in your life. The righteous respond in faith and throw it back on him. The righteous will be those that are repenting of their sins, believing in God's promises, and relying on God's strength in prayer. That's who the righteous are. And so the king promises here, and this is the promise that he gives. If you cast your burden on the Lord, he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. That is what the righteous gets. But he also gives you another promise. If someone has wronged you unjustly and is unrepentant, verse 23, but this is what the wicked get. Here's what those who do not repent, do not believe, and do not turn to God in prayer and faith receive. But you, O God, will cast them down into the pit of destruction. Men of blood and treachery shall not live out half their days. It's interesting. What happened to Absalom? He hung on a tree until Joab thrust him through with a spear. What happened to Ahithophel? He went back home and he killed himself. What happened to Judas when he betrayed Jesus? He hung himself and fell, and it says pretty disgustingly, he burst open. It's a reminder for all time that if you live to kill and betray other people, if you desire to live in an unjust, murderous fashion, that will circle back to you according to God's justice. You will not escape. Destruction is the fate of all those who turn their back on God and his anointed king. Not one injustice will not be righted. It will all be righted in the end. And then David says this, but I will trust in you. That's how he finishes this psalm of betrayal. He comes back around and he says, you know what? That's fine. I was betrayed by my close companion. Does that upset me? Yes. But where should my trust be anyway? It should be in the Lord. There's a clear contrast. Ultimately, you cannot trust even your closest friends who are at best still men, but you can always trust in God, just as Jesus the King did. In the darkest of hours, you can cling to him who is enthroned of old. You can cast your burden on the Lord this evening, and he will sustain you, and he will not ever permit you to be moved. And that is a promise that we can cling to tonight in our focus of prayer, especially as we go into confession, that God holds us fast through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. So, as we did last